and welcome to another episode of Tell Muses, a podcast by storytellers, with storytellers, for storytellers, and for anyone interested in the art of oral storytelling. Today we have with us, all the way from England, a lovely muse called Dan Sedge. Hello and welcome, Dan.
Hello.
Hello, it's lovely to be here. Thank you so much. And hello from Ipswich on the far east coast of England in Suffolk.
Dan, I should tell you and our listeners that this season of Tell Muses is under GAWI's wing this year. And GAWI, for people who haven't heard about it before, is an acronym for Get a Word in Edgeways, which is a lovely little festival that takes place every October in Much Wenlock. Much Wenlock is a very traditional little town at the border next to Wales, but on the English side, and it is highly recommended. People are strongly advised to go and experience it on their own. And actually, I think that is where I met you, Dan. Is that right?
Yes, I think it was. Gary. And it is, like you say, it's a beautiful place and a beautiful festival. I always find myself looking at Much Wenlock as if I'm an American visiting England. I always imagine sort of looking at things and going, oh, look at that. Isn't that old? You know what I mean?
Yeah, but it's the town also, but not just the town. I think more than that, it is the warm people that organize it and the lovely artists they have every year that differ from year to year. And then you were there as a member of the East Anglian Storytellers, right?
Yeah, East Anglian Storytelling Festival. I saw you there in the summer this year. And I've become very much involved this year in the organisation of that festival as well. So I've been attending meetings, and East Anglia has a really kind of rich storytelling tradition, which I had no idea about that until a couple of years ago. So it's been really nice to kind of connect with that side of things in my local area.
I know a few things about you already, but I think this is the first time Simona gets to meet you.
Yeah. So Dan, can you tell us something about how you got involved into storytelling? So you just said, I had no idea that we had this rich storytelling tradition until a couple of years ago. So how did you get involved into storytelling?
My getting involved into storytelling came through being a primary school teacher. About 20 years ago, I was in my first year of teaching in a big school in the area of Ipswich, where there are lots of problems, like an area with quite sort of dense poverty and lots of substance misuse problems and knife crime and things like that. And I was teaching this class, such hard work. It felt like a class full of big burly boys. And one afternoon, it was a Sunday afternoon, and you know the Sunday feeling. If you're a teacher, the Sunday feeling is big. And I was in a park in Ipswich with a friend of mine, and he'd just been on I think a psychotherapy course where they had used storytelling. And he said, I want you, next time things in your classroom feel like they're getting out of hand or everyone's kind of overexcited or whatever, I want you to try and tell them this story. And we were sitting in the park drinking a beer, and he told me the story of the hat maker and the monkeys, which seems to be quite a staple. And I thought to myself, as he told it to me, if I tell my class that story, they're just going to think I'm ridiculous. This is going to go down so badly. And it was the middle of the summer, and the next day at lunchtime, there'd been a big fight over a football match, and they all came back into the classroom, and they were red and sweaty and angry, and everybody had fallen out. And I thought, well, this is my moment. I'd promised my friend I was going to tell this story, and I started to tell the story, and it was just the most magical moment, because what I thought was going to happen was that they would just think it was ridiculous, and there was magic in the room. It was almost like the air began to crackle, and they said, oh, you've got to tell that next time you do an assembly, say you've got to tell that in assembly. And that was my first story, really, and that was before I had children of my own. And then throughout my teaching career, I then collected stories as I went, but without ever getting involved in the storytelling community, just doing my own thing. The staff from somebody's got to do assembly, and all the other teachers would be making no eye contact. And I'd be like, I've got a new story I want to try out in assembly. So I told stories for probably 16 or 17 years without really ever hearing another storyteller as an adult. But what I'd forgotten as well is that when I was at primary school, I had seen Hugh Lupton, He'd come into my primary school because he's from just up the road in Norfolk. And John Rowe had been into Hamford Hall where I was as well. So really, throughout my life, there's been these little seeds of you should be a storyteller coming in, and I've either ignored them or gone with them a bit. And it's only really the last couple of years that I've got out to meet everybody and met Despina and been to a few festivals. And that all came from going to an open mic night in Ipswich, which is run by a guy called Jerry Donlan and a lady called Vero Chambers. And the feedback was really good. So since then, I've gone into more adult storytelling. But it all goes back to that one day in about 2005 in a classroom in Ipswich.
Well, both Simone and I truly understand in our skin what Sunday means to educators, for sure.
Yeah.
And I think we've both been in that magical field that manifests when you get the kids hooked in a story. Yeah, it's incredible. That's what storytelling is. It always exceeds your expectations, I think. But Dan, you know what? I've been following you around on Facebook and I saw something very interesting you do, which is the whole essence of storytelling for me, which is storytelling for a cause. So, Simona, you see this lovely fellow in front of you right now, very healthy, very athletic, and you could never imagine what comes behind that, because Dan is trying to pass across a very particular message for people who are struggling with addiction. Would you like to tell us about that, Dan? I think it's so important.
Yes. So I said about the area that I was working in when I was teaching in Ipswich. I mentioned substance misuse issues, and I was hearing stories from the children coming into my classroom about how mum or dad was passed out on the sofa last night, or there were various really quite severe addiction issues. And I was trying to deal with that and communicating with social services regarding certain individuals in my class, etc., etc. And in the background, my life was completely falling apart due to mainly alcohol itself, really. So I spent a very long time, well, very, very addicted to alcohol to a degree where my teaching career ended because I just couldn't do it anymore. I was completely on my knees, and whilst the quantities and things are unimportant really when it comes to addiction, everyone suffers from addiction in different ways. By the end of my addiction, I was drinking from the first thing in the morning till going to bed at night, and I was going missing, and I was having suicide attempts, and I was getting arrested. I was just completely out of control. And at the middle of 2018, my mum, who was living in Cairo at the time, came back. She sort of appeared in my house, and I had no idea why she was there. And she had borrowed a load of money to put me into rehab. So I went from being this teacher who told quite a lot of stories to someone who was checked into for 6 weeks living in a residential rehab. In the rehab, quite quickly, away from alcohol and being detoxed and things like that, I found that the other people in the rehab, people recovering from heroin addiction and crack cocaine and all that kind of stuff, really appreciated my stories and my storytelling. And when I left rehab and I continue to be very involved in the recovery community in Ipswich, I'm going to prisons to share my story. I'm going to high schools as well to share my recovery story. I kind of realized that when you are sober and when you are able to live a life that is organized and positive, that you can make choices about what you want to do. And it was then that I decided to go full time with the storytelling, because I knew that if I put my heart and my soul and my passion into it, just like I did my recovery, that it would work. And as you said about fit and athletic, the way I live my life now is I've already done 90 minutes in the gym this morning, and that's what I do most mornings. And I spend my time trying to help the next poor person who comes with horrible alcohol withdrawals or addiction, to show them, partly through storytelling, that there is a way of living a life without substances and without the crushing pressure of being in that prison of addiction.
That's really something amazing that you do, Dan. Are there any specific kind of stories that you use? So you said that you partly use storytelling in this process. What kind of stories do you use?
I intertwine traditional stories with bits of my own story. But there's a story called The Initiation of Malik Dinar, which you may or may not have come across. It's an old Sufi teaching story. I read it initially in an Idris Shah book, and then I did a load of research about this guy, Malik Dinar. And what happens in the story is he's family owned a vineyard, and he is become a hopeless drunk because he can't figure out how to stop drinking. And he then decides he's going to go on a path of enlightenment. And he comes across a dervish who shows him these opportunities. He's like, I know I'm looking for enlightenment when I'm not going to engage in all these little missions that you give me. And he realizes at the end that the missions were all pathways to finding those moments where there's this realization both for the character and the listener that all of these things that the dervish is trying to guide him towards, like there's a tree that seems to be calling out and some ants trying to look for help excavating under a hill where there turns out to be treasure, and that actually all of life is there to teach. And it's not even about the journey you're on, it's about who you become on the way, isn't it? And about going through those doors. But I also use stories that I was telling or that I heard during different points in my recovery. So I left the job at the school I was talking about and got a job in a village school just outside of Ipswich. And the head teacher was really on board with storytelling. And I'd been saying to him, oh, can we get a storyteller in? Can we get a storyteller in? And this was at a point when I was very, very hungover every morning, like actually having physical withdrawals from alcohol. And I got into my classroom one day just wanting the world to disappear, really. And my head teacher had booked Toop to come and tell stories in my classroom. I've seen a lot of storytellers, and Toop is absolute top tier storyteller. And I was sat in the back of my classroom and he walked in and he was just this kind of picture of self-assured, a guy who had it all together. He was dressed in these kind of resplendent robes. And there was me at the back withdrawing off alcohol, thinking the last thing you want to see when you're in that sort of state is someone who looks like they've got it all together. And the class came in and I sat at the back of the class just thinking, I just wish the ground would open up and swallow me. I hate this situation. I hate this class. I hate this storyteller. I just want to be out of here. And he opened up with a Nasruddin story. And it was the story where Nasruddin, he's been invited to a wedding and he goes through all his robes and they're all too dirty. So he goes to wash the robes. And as he goes down to the river, his little kitten follows him. And Nasruddin's washing all the clothes and wringing them out with his big hand. At the end, he looks down at the cat and he thinks, oh, the cat looks dirty too. I'll wash the cat. And his friend comes by and says, oh, you mustn't wash that cat. If you wash that cat, you will kill it. And he says, no, I won't kill the cat. I'll wash the cat. And he starts washing the cat and his friend walks off. And a little while later, his friend comes back and finds Nasruddin on a rock sitting and he's sobbing, holding a limp dead cat. And he says, I told you if you washed that cat, you would kill it. And he says, no, you don't understand. It wasn't when I washed her. It was when I went to wring her out. And it was one of those moments in my life where something beautiful and something funny cut through the kind of misery that I was feeling. And it was just this amazing moment where I realized the power of storytelling. And I'd realized it in terms of telling stories with the moment with the Hatmaker story and all these kids in Ipswich. And then it was almost like it had worked on me, if that makes sense. It was one of those moments where I thought, oh, this is life-changing stuff, this storytelling. So yeah, I use lots of stories like that as well.
It makes perfect sense. I remember once I had a call from my then best friend who was far away in the middle of chemos and in a very bad state, and she had given me a call in a state of panic. And then out of the blue, it just came to me as an inspiration. I started telling her a story I was working on at that time that had nothing to do with her or her life or her situation. Nothing she could relate to, just a story, a magical fairy tale. And she just breathed. She was able to breathe after that. It just took her away from what she was going through at that moment. It was incredible. I think it was the most shocking and intimate story I've ever told. I mean, seeing the immediate effect it had on another person, it was the strongest experience I've had with stories, I think, that one. But as you said, Dan, very well, when you are in a situation like that, the last thing you need is a success story. That's not it. That's not the point. I mean, I can go out and tell stories about people who are suffering from an addiction, and sometimes they might be the hero of the story, sometimes they might be the villain, but it does not reflect in my life because I have not been through that, and not in such an extent anyway, and it is totally different when it comes from a person who has actually been there and been through it. Very, very different experience. I think that people can sense if it reflects on your own life, what you're saying, and it's all the stronger. But speaking of all these stories you tell and share, do you think we could have a story then?
Yeah, you can definitely have a story. Yes. So I told you about the hat maker story that I told at the school in Ipswich. That was the first story that I told. And the second story that I told, so I went back to my friend and because I didn't know any other storytellers, and he's not really a storyteller. And I said, Ezra, have you got another one? Because that one went so well. And I've often found, like, I can hear stories that people tell, and I think that's a great story, but I could never tell that, because the story, I find that when I'm looking for stories or I'm researching stories or I'm creating stories, I know if they're me. Do you know what I mean? Like in Harry Potter, the wizard chooses the wand. I find very much the same thing about stories. And I find that it's impossible to force a story. And I try and force stories. And I always tell them first to my children. And my children are my toughest crowd, easily my toughest crowd. My children will just look at me and go, no, Dad, no, 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 no. Back to the drawing board you go. I suppose this was the first story that ever really felt that it fitted me perfectly. And it follows a pickpocket. The pickpocket worked on Oxford Street, and by his own admission, he was the best pickpocket in all of London. He could do things with picking pockets that nobody else could do. So taking a wallet from somebody's pocket was basic. He could have necklaces from people's necks, watches off people's wrists. He could see people walking through the London streets, staring aimlessly at their phones and scrolling, and suddenly their finger would be stroking the palm of their hand as their phone had disappeared. He could see people on their way to the office, and they would be talking like people on their way to the office do. Oh, yes, yes, Hamish, I'll be there in 5. And then they'd be saying, hello, hello, and their phone would have gone out of their hand. Amazing pickpocket. And one day this pickpocket was coming out of Oxford Street onto the corner of Charing Cross Road to look at the things that he'd stolen. And he felt a hand go into his pocket. And he turned round, and all of a sudden, looking at him was the most beautiful lady he'd ever seen. And she just tried to pick his pocket. And he said, hang on a second, what do you think? You have no idea whose pocket you just tried to pick. I'm the best pickpocket in all of London. And she said, whoa, 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 whoa. Let's pause there a second, because I think you'll find I'm the best pickpocket in all of London. And the two of them looked at each other, both brains working quickly as to see how they could prove themselves to be the best pickpocket in all of London. And in a moment of inspiration, they decided they were going to work together. And over the coming weeks and months, they worked together. Sometimes the pickpocket would distract the marks as they walked up the street, and the lady pickpocket would pick their pockets. And sometimes it was the other way around. They became very, very wealthy. And then one day, after they'd finished picking pockets and they were about to head their separate ways home, the pickpocket came over all bashful. He was looking a bit nervous, a bit edgy, a bit like he wanted to say something, but he didn't quite know what he wanted to say. And eventually she said to him, what is it? Come on, spit it out. What's going on with you? And he said, well, I was just wondering if rather than go straight home tonight, we could go and have a meal together. And she said, oh, what, you mean like a date? And he said, well, yes. And she's, oh, that is beautiful news. We get on so well. I can't believe you haven't asked me. I was going to ask you myself. So they went and they found a lovely restaurant. They ate lovely food, drank lovely drinks, had lovely talks, told stories to each other, talked in a way that was above that work level. They normally kept things very professional. And they became boyfriend and girlfriend. And over the coming months, they got on so well that they decided to trial moving in together. And about a year after that first date, the pickpocket once again was kind of bashful. He was being a bit strange, just like he had before. And she said, what is going on with you today? And he said, well, I was just wondering if maybe we could go to the same restaurant that we went to on that first date. And she said, oh, that is a lovely idea. Let's do that. Let's go back to that restaurant. And they went back to that restaurant. They ate the same food, drank the same drinks, reminisced on the stories they told each other a year before. And as they finished eating their meal, the pickpocket stood up. He got down on one knee and he asked her to marry him. And she said, I cannot believe, I know it's only been a year, but I can't believe it's taken you this long. I was going to ask you. It's just the right decision. We must make this happen. And so, beautifully, they became married. And the wedding was big and they had this great time. And a few months after, the lady pickpocket started in the mornings to feel a little bit sick. And she was looking a bit tired and a bit sort of grey in her skin. And she thought she knew what was going on. So she went and she took a pregnancy test. And when she came back, she said, look, we're going to have a baby. It's positive. And this baby is going to be the best pickpocket the world has ever seen. And they were overjoyed. Over the coming months, her tummy got bigger and bigger and her walking got more and more laboured. And eventually she would stay at home while the pickpocket went out and picked pockets. And one morning, he'd only been out a little while, his phone rang. And she said, the baby is coming. I'm having cramps. We've got to get to the hospital now. So he rushed home. They drove to hospital and the baby was born. The midwife held the baby for the first time and put her on the chest of her mother. And as they looked down at the baby, she had all the correct amount of fingers and toes. She was breathing. She could certainly cry, but there was a problem. The baby's fist was stuck under her chin, her hand across her body. And no matter what the midwives did, they couldn't move it. And they called for the doctors, who called for the consultants. They all looked down at the baby. And whatever they did, they couldn't move her fist away from under her chin. And the pickpockets were overjoyed because they'd become parents for the first time. And they were overjoyed that their daughter seemed to be healthy. But there was this nagging fear and doubt in the backs of their chests that she's not going to be able to be quite the pickpocket that we hoped she was going to be. And over the coming months, they took her to different doctors around London, private doctors, NHS doctors, all sorts of paediatricians who looked down and they couldn't figure out anything. They looked at scans of the baby's elbow and of her wrist, and there didn't seem to be anything wrong until they got a tip-off. And the tip-off was that a doctor who had worked all over the world, in Athens and in Delhi and in Rome and in New York, had come and she had set up her offices in London. And the tip-off told them that if anyone could help their daughter, this lady was the person. So the next day they went to the offices of this doctor. And we say offices, but imagine the poshest hotel, huge white walls, chandeliers, statues around the place, a really classy, posh central London office. And behind the desk at the end of this reception area was a lady who looked down her nose at them. And she said, I'm terribly, terribly sorry. You don't look, she looked the pickpocket up and down, and he was wearing like a football shirt and he had a shaved head and jeans, and he just looked not like the sort of person. She said, I'm terribly sorry, but it costs £2,000 an hour to see the lady doctor. And you frankly don't look like the sort of people who would have that sort of money. The pickpocket reached into his pocket and he pulled out £2,000 in cash. And the lady's whole demeanour changed. Oh, sorry, I'm terribly sorry, sir. Do come this way. I will make sure the lady doctor is ready to see you at the nearest opportunity. And so they went in to see the doctor, and they laid their daughter, who's about 6 or 7 months old by this point, still with her fist under her chin. And the paediatrician looked down at their daughter and she said, you know what? I think I can help. Let's do a little massage on this baby's arm. And by the end of that first session, she'd managed to, for the first time, move the baby's fist just a couple of inches away from her chin. But when they left, her fist went straight back under her chin. And over the coming months, they'd now spent thousands and thousands of pounds. But each time they went to see the doctor, her arm would straighten out a little more. And 10 visits in, £20,000 later, the pickpockets are starting to worry about the amount of money they're spending on this and worrying if it's sustainable. Now, quite quickly, the doctor can straighten out the arm of their daughter, and she starts to work on the fingers. And the pickpockets are looking down on the baby's straight arm, thinking we're going to see the little beautiful wrinkly palm of our daughter for the first time. The doctor pulls the baby's little finger and then the baby's ring finger. And as the doctor manages to straighten the baby's middle finger, they all look down and notice that in the baby's palm is the wedding ring of the midwife who delivered her.
It's brilliant. She really was the best pickpocket in the world.
She was.
It was in her DNA. What could she do?
Yeah.
So is this one of the stories you have shared with the children?
Yeah, so I shared that with children probably early 2006. So I've been telling that story for, 20 years, really. And it's evolved and it's changed like stories do. But it's always one that I will always go back to that because I know that everybody loves that story. Although I did have a complaint in a school that I visited recently, my only ever complaint, which was that I was telling stories which promoted a criminal lifestyle.
Oh, right.
But I stand by it. I think I didn't take that criticism too badly.
Well, it's not all black and white, you know. It's not as if some of the kids want to know about theft.
The theft is merely a vehicle for the story, right?
It's a brilliant story. And have you heard it like this the first time, or have you modernized it? Because I think I heard this story, but maybe the older version, like a set in older times.
Yeah, so I think the version I heard, it was set in London, but it was all a bit sort of Oliver Twist. Yeah, because I've told it so many times. One of my things that I do a lot in schools is I do 2-day projects where I spend a day working with a year group or a key stage, depending on the size of the school, and get them telling stories, and then go back on a second day and they tell stories to the younger children. And one of my things that I'm really passionate about, a group of year 6 children in this country have had all their creativity bashed out of them. So their whole thing is that they want to write sentences with fronted adverbials and subordinate clauses and blah de blah. And I always say to them, however you record this story, it doesn't matter. It could be pictures, it could be anything you like, as long as it's got the key elements in it. And I can tell that pickpocket story in under 30 seconds, which is what I do with these children, and say to them, if I wrote out a story word by word and then tried to learn it, for a start, my brain does not work like that. So there's no way. But also that every time I tell a story, it's different. So that story has evolved slowly. Like when I first told that story, everybody wasn't walking around scrolling on phones the whole time. I mean, how scary is that? And now they are. And that feels a bit to me like when I remember saying that bit for the first time, and all the adults around the room just kind of like nodded, because that's a real example. Is I think stories are like living things, aren't they? They're organisms which adapt to their surroundings. I mean, I've walked back from the gym this morning. I walked through Ipswich town centre, and there's just people everywhere scrolling on their phones, and I feel like I would be doing storytelling and the modern world a disservice not to include that somewhere, because it shows the ridiculousness of it, doesn't it? But yeah, certainly I heard I guess a Victorian version when I first heard it.
No matter what the time circumstances are, it's always the thug life, isn't it?
Yeah.
I can understand how that comes from an adult's morality, that point of view. What about the kids? How do the kids react to the story?
There's always a stunned moment of silence at the end where they sort of figure out what's happened,
Yeah.
which I really enjoy. I love those moments, and it suddenly catches on around the room. I don't know about everywhere else, but I think it's because lots of the stories that children certainly here grow up with are like the Aesop's fables, right? So you tell your story and then you say, right, and what was the moral of that story? And they they say, I don't know, they say, oh, it was slow and steady wins the race, or it was whatever it is. because children will inevitably, because of that kind of programming in their brains, they will look for a moral in a story. And I like to say to them, are there any messages that you found in that story which are relevant to you? And there's always at least 5 or 6 different ones for that story, because there's the kind of obvious, don't judge a book by its cover. That's what comes out from the children who think they want to give the right answer. Do you know what I mean?
It's not their fault. They've been, what is the right word? Groomed this way.
Absolutely, yeah. But then if you explore that story a bit deeper, there's all sorts of things going on in that story, isn't there? And I find that children, they just love that story. They want to retell it. And one of the moments when I decided to really go give storytelling a full go was during lockdown. I had set up all these groups online because I was working with lots of homeschool children in my early sobriety. So I'd have groups of homeschool children here, or I would go out to places where groups of homeschool children were meeting. And everyone was off school over the entire world. I was teaching this one particular group, and there were a couple of children who were in Bahrain. There was a child from China. There was a child who was looking out with his iPad out the window over the mountains in Pakistan. And then there were some kids from Stowmarket and some kids from Ipswich, just this kind of amazing, diverse group. And I was telling these stories, and I told that. And the next week, one of them came back and he said, I've told my little cousin that story. And then the others were like, oh, I told my mum that story. And I just suddenly had this image of this story that I'd placed just in front of these children, hadn't told them to share it. It had gone global. And that was something I wanted to be doing full. It's always been my passion, but I wanted to make it into something more than that, really.
I hate explaining stories. You don't leave room for interpretation or creativity to flow if you do that for them. It's needless work, and it has the contrary effect than the one we aim at. But I wanted to ask you about another thing. I see you did something with CB Jackson. Only dads would know. Would you like to tell us about that?
Yeah. So CB Jackson is another storyteller. Well, he's not from Ipswich, but he lives in Ipswich now. And we both like being recorded. So people say to me, if I've got to be on camera for anything, do you mind being filmed? Because people do, and I don't. I absolutely love being recorded and filmed. And Jackson came to me with an idea for a podcast, which was to incorporate storytelling and our experience as fathers into a podcast. So I think we've done about 8, maybe 9 episodes of that now. And each time we talk about a different theme and relate it to both stories and being dads. So there's one about my addiction. There's one about maintaining friendships as a 40-year-old or 60-year-old, in Jackson's case, man, and about parenting your own parents, because we've both this year found ourselves as 2-generation dads in managing our own lives, but also the lives of our parents and our own children as well. It gets quite emotional and deep, that podcast at times. It's been lovely and it's been really well received, and people seem to like it. So we're going to keep doing it.
But let's promote it a little bit. What is the name of the podcast? How can people find it?
I'm terrible at promoting things. It's called Only Dads Get This, and it's available on all streaming platforms. And we're on Instagram, and I do everything with my iPhones. It's certainly on Apple, and I know it's on Spotify, and I think it's on Podbean, but it's everywhere. And Jackson's done all that. I just go and talk. Jackson is editing and managing and computers and things.
Brilliant. We'll definitely listen to that. Is it also for people who are not dads or moms, parents?
Well, I don't know if we'll get it, Simona. It's only dads get it.
Oh, yeah. Only dads get it.
You'll get it if you listen. You'll get it then. I get so many messages saying I'm a mum or I'm not a mum or whatever, and I get people do listen to it. So I don't know. I suppose it's a sort of insight into our perceptions of being dads. Because another project that I'm running at the moment is a thing with Jackson called masculine positive, where we've been going into some schools to deliver talks, workshops with storytelling, because there's a lot of talk around toxic masculinity and all sorts of characters around the world who are being masculine in what seems like a very unhelpful way to many people, and that there's ways of being masculine in a positive way, and trying to find that kind of line between what is positive and what is negative, really. I mean, really, it's a podcast about two men who are starting to get on a bit, I suppose.
That's brilliant. I love this kind of applied storytelling to help for a cause or to talk about something, explain something, to reason with people. And also, I was thinking while you told the story of the pickpocket, I was laughing and laughing, and it felt a little bit like stand-up comedy, because the kind of stand-up comedy that I like is not the kind of rude stand-up comedy where they make fun of people, but I like the kind of stand-up comedy that talks about things that reason with us and make us realize how funny certain situations in life are, that maybe we complain about something, but then we realize that actually that's a funny situation. And if you look at it from a different angle, it's just funny. And it felt the same thing when you started telling us the story of all these people walking around the streets, looking at their phones and the pickpockets taking their phones out of their hands without people even realizing that. And how funny and how strange is that situation that we walk around the streets with our phones in our hands and we don't even realize what is around us. That certainly was something that we can reason with, I think. And the same thing goes with other emotions. So if you have a funny story, you can reason with that because it's something that you live. But if it's a more profound story, you reason with the story because you understand what's going on. It's similar to what you live and experience in your life. This kind of applied storytelling that you're doing.
I think on some level, there's a moment when you tell a story and you realize something about it yourself that you didn't realize before you were telling it. There's a moment when he's doing that. Whilst he's stealing from people, he's liberating people from this toxic culture of being attached to a phone.
Yeah, right. Speaking like the devil's advocate. Thank you for liberating me from my iPhone. I was enslaved and I hadn't realized before you took it away from me. I was thinking about what you said earlier about positive masculinity and how much we need it, because we don't only need to hear about the... Okay, criticism is definitely a major aspect of how we have to fight different social rules when we were kids. I mean, decades change and society slowly goes with it. Luckily, in this part of the woods at least, it's not like that everywhere, but we start evolving like society concerning the two or more genders, and we're more accepting and more inclusive. I was thinking about how you said about positive masculinity. Taking a story from the perspective of a man, and this is why I enjoy listening to stories from men occasionally, is totally different to my take. I remember once I had Victor Wind. Victor Wind is a storyteller based in London, and he has the Museum of Curiosities. Anyway, a very interesting guy, but he was giving a version, I think it was of Bluebeard, most likely Bluebeard. So for people not familiar with it, that is a serial killer committing femicides quite so often, marrying the women first and then getting rid of them in an awful way. So Victor starts telling this tale, speaking about the man at the beginning, the very beginning, saying that he never took a wife from around the place where he lived, because you never take a dump in your own backyard now, do you? But that old lady's daughters were so beautiful he just couldn't resist. Right? I would never thought about it that way. You enter a serial killer's mind and you know that he's not going to pick a victim from where he's going to get suspected. I had never thought of that way. And I don't think that way of thinking would have come out from a woman. You see?
No,
Yeah.
no.
What you do is probably very, very useful for the kids. Even if it's primary, even if it's preteens, they still need to hear stuff like that. So, would you like to tell us a little bit about your current work on storytelling?
So I do all sorts of things, but in the last year, now I run a CIT and it's called Chapter 82. And the aim is to use storytelling to promote mental fitness and engagement with story and love of narrative and things like that. The reason I set it up in the beginning was as a reaction. I mentioned briefly earlier about how the way language is taught in this country now has removed the love and it's removed the story. Not completely, but really everything is taught. You have to be able to write a correct sentence. And it has to include certain things, certain amounts of adjectives and adverbs and all this stuff. And watching my children go through school, they hate their English lessons. They hate them because it's become like maths. So everything is either right or it's wrong. Everything I do is about promoting a love of story and narrative. This year, somebody came to me and they said, I've got this money that you can have if you can access these certain schools, which are very difficult to access in Ipswich because schools are a bit like fortresses. They have secretaries on the desks and they are trained to get people away, you know. And I did a project with Ipswich Windrush Society, an amazing guy called Max Thomas, who uses objects. He's got a reflection room in Ipswich town centre, and it is all objects from his parents who were first generation Windrush, came over from Jamaica. And we went into schools. So I was doing traditional storytelling, and he was looking at how objects can tell stories. And that's where I came up with this idea of the 2-day project. So we do a day storytelling with some older children and then get them telling stories to younger children. I have done quite a lot of work in high schools this year on addiction. So sharing my story of being an alcoholic and a drug addict. What else have I done this year? I do sort of lots of little projects all the time where I get little pockets of money, most because schools are poor in this country at the moment. They don't have any money to bring creative people in. So I find myself applying for money and then delivering projects. I did some work with one of the special schools in Ipswich with a creative artist. I was telling stories and the children were responding with learning sort of different weaving techniques and things like that. Yeah, I've been doing all sorts of things this year. My mind's kind of blank. But really, my favourite thing to do is going to schools. I ran a project for fathers in early recovery from addiction, trying to get them telling stories to their children to mend these damaged and distorted relationships with their children, which have been damaged and distorted by drugs and alcohol. But the problem with working with people in early recovery is that most people who get into recovery don't stay in recovery. So I would be there with this group of blokes one week, and then one of them will be gone, and one of them got recalled to prison, one of them relapsed. Because there's a lot of funding for things like that, because people say, oh, yeah, that's a really marginalised group in society, and they're really hard to engage with. And when you try and engage with them, you realise they're hard to engage with for a reason, and that they love the things when they're there, but their life takes over. And the other thing I did was a project in Emmaus, which is a homeless charity in Ipswich, working with people who are all over 80, getting them telling their stories about growing up. So I would lead with one of my stories, and then they would just share. It was called Friends and Fables, and they were sort of isolated older people. That was a wonderful thing, you know, sort of hear these stories of your town from the 60s and 50s even.
Well, that's brilliant work. And also learning about the problems that you have with getting called in schools. We've got the same problem here in Italy that fundings are, well, missing completely. I had to go in a school and do a project this year. We had agreed that I would do the project in the school, and then they called me last month and said they cut our fundings in half and we don't have the money to call you in anymore. And it's happening every time lately. they get always less funding. And it's sad because you don't invest in the future of the people that will live in your country, because the children that go to school, as you said, it's the same thing here in Italy. We focus on writing things correctly. And I remember going to middle school and studying the analysis of all the grammar of all the words in a sentence in the first year, and in the second year we would go with chunks, and in the third year we would have to analyze the whole sentences and understand what kind of sentence that was. But who cares about that? What about the love of stories, the love of literature and all these things, and creativity? You just cut all those things out and replace them with things that make kids hate school. Yeah. And you see it growing up, because I work as an English specialist or a storyteller, depending where they call me. And I work in every kind of school. So wherever they call me, I go. So I work in elementary school, middle school, high school. And you see in elementary school how excited they are about school. And how excited they are about learning. And then you go to middle school and you just want to get out of there as quickly as possible, because they hate being there and they hate you because you're there. Even if you try to engage them, they don't want to hear anything that you say, because everything has been drained out of them. And then maybe in high school there are some that try to start rebelling and they want to do something creative, so they listen to you. But at the same time, some of them are just like, no, I don't want to listen to this anymore. And it's just so sad to see. What you're doing is really important. That's the bottom line, I think. That's what I wanted to say.
Part of what you're describing is what goes through the minds of teenagers. It's not just the system draining them, it's that probably because in our world, ever since the Grimm fairy tales, I think we have connected storytelling and fairy tales with young children. The teenagers need to differentiate themselves from listening to childish stories, or what they consider it to be something for much younger people than they are now. Like, they are becoming young adults and they need to prove it, right? So they have to rebel. They have to go through that stage. But it very much depends on the kind of stories you pick for a different age group. And what's in the story, not just whether it is a matter of concern to them, if it has to do with sports or football or anything that could catch their attention because they like it. It's also things that make them think about their own lives. And of course, you will never get 100% of them as an audience, but some of them you will. Dan, what's your experience?
So there's 2 points on that, really. One is, I only really know about the education system here, but I think it's probably throughout most of the world. We have become, over the last however many years, and I watched it as I was a teacher get more and more this way, obsessed with anything that we can measure. So as long as we can measure things, then they're worth doing. Creative pursuits are far more difficult to measure. And I think there's this emphasis on writing and reading and maths anyway. But also, if we can reduce English down into something that can be measured, so we look at a sentence and we can say, right, this sentence has these things in it, whether it's small children and they've got a full stop, or whether it's my 9-year-old is talking about fronted adverbial phrases. And I don't know about you, Despina, but I never learned any of that. In the 80s, here, I never learned grammar. I mean, I do put full stops and commas and things in my sentences, but it was never put to me. It was kind of taught as this sort of holistic story-based thing. And my children are very much switched off from it. But I find, certainly with older children, so I go into high schools, but quite a lot of what I do in high schools is to do with addiction. So I will sometimes introduce the story about Nasruddin and the cat. I will begin by telling that story and the story of me hearing that story, as in the state I was in at the time. And sometimes I'm telling that to 300 people, and you tell them that story and suddenly they're in with you, because it's got that combination of the misery that I was in, and then there's this kind of humorous element to it and this thing of hope, but also doing what I do, of the nature of how alcoholism is when I'm working with older children. So I'm there and they say, this is Dan and he's here to talk about alcohol awareness. And you can see the kids like, roll their eyes like, oh, here we go. He's going to tell us not to drink and do drugs. Yeah. Before I did that for the first time, I went to some of in AA. I don't know if you know about how Alcoholics Anonymous works, but there's no professionals. It's all people who've recovered from alcoholism, helping other people to recover from alcoholism. So I went to some of my younger people that I talked to and I said, what would have helped you if somebody had come into your school to talk about alcoholism? Because when I was a kid, it was all just don't do drugs, but do drink, but not too much. You know, it's this kind of just nonsense thing. I tell stories. I mean, I know quite a few people who have served life sentences in prison for acts of violence that they cannot remember committing.
Wow.
You say that, I mean, it's all about a hook, isn't it? I find when I go into schools, it's like, how do I get the hook in so that then whatever I say next will be not only accepted, but get them hanging on every word. And I think with that, I find the pickpocket story in any primary school, if I tell that first, whatever I say for the rest of the day, they are in because they've heard that story. Or I think you've heard me tell the story about the apple seller and the camel seller. That's another one, but it's got a murder in it. It's got this horrible moment in it. I think that you can engage any audience. It's all about the start. For me, that's what I've always found. It's always about the beginning. And also, as a storyteller, I find that certainly storytellers who I come across, particularly English storytellers, tend to fit into one of a few kind of profiles. And I don't want to say anything that's going to upset anyone, but there's various stereotypes of what an English storyteller will be like, whether it's the kind of Tudor bard or the sort of wizard-esque. Do you know what I mean? And I think because I got involved in the storytelling community very late, I didn't end up going down any of those routes. So I think when I'm introduced as a storyteller, children and adults are quite surprised by the stories that I tell because I'm wearing a football shirt and I don't look a certain way. I'm always dressed the same wherever I'm going.
Yeah, you don't look like a performative storyteller, right? But you are a storyteller. From the short videos you upload on Facebook, I remember one that really got to me, and it was talking about the upcoming holidays. And I don't know when we're going to upload this episode. Holidays will probably be way past us, but still, this is a very strong message and very necessary one out there for people to listen to, whatever the case, whatever the circumstances. And you were going on and on about how people tend to treat other people in a totally superficial way by telling them that, oh, come on, it's just a drink. Well, you cannot have a beer. And they keep putting pressure on a person who's just recovering. And that may be the beginning of the end for the other person. And they don't even realize what they're doing.
Yeah. Well, alcohol is the only drug that you have to justify not taking, isn't it? It's the only drug that where people think, oh yeah. I think it's so entrenched in our culture that it becomes this kind of, what, you're not drinking, spoil sport.
Not even one.
Yeah, not even one. And I think the thing about any alcoholic who knows that they're an alcoholic is having one is not possible.
Yeah, of course.
Because once you're in, and that's that. So don't do that to people this Christmas. And if you have, don't do it next Christmas.
And don't do it in general, Christmas or not, period. Just don't
No,
do
never
it.
do it. But it seems to be a kind of an outbreak of it at Christmas.
Indeed. So do you think we could have a story to end this interview with, Dan?
Yeah. Sometimes you hear a story and it's just at the right moment and you feel almost personally attacked by it, but then you realize it was the right time to hear that story. So I heard this story, I don't know, I think I've been telling this about 4 or 5 years. And it was at a time where I was sulking with somebody. You know how we sulk sometimes, even storytellers sulk from time to time. And I was sulking, and the story is set in Marrakesh. the finest couple in all of Marrakesh, if not Morocco, are married. And their wedding has been a beautiful, beautiful wedding. And they've been showered with gifts from family all over the world. They're both kind of brave and intelligent and beautiful people. And they've got married. And after the wedding is finished and the guests have gone home, they go back to their brand new house in the middle of Marrakesh. In their living room, they are surrounded by gifts, fruits from around the world, foods that they've never even seen or tried before, magnificent succulent cuts of meat, carpets that have been brought from the finest carpet makers, jewelry. All of their wedding gifts are spread out around them, and they both sit down on the sofa. And as they sit down on the sofa, the wife looks up and she sees that the front door of the house has been left open. And she says, "Husband, we've left the front door of the house open. You must go over and shut the front door." And the husband looks down at his clothes, his wedding gear that he hasn't even got off yet. And he says, "Wife, there is no way I'm going to go and shut the door on my wedding day in my wedding clothes. Me, the finest man in all of Marrakesh. You go and shut the door." And she says, "Wait, hang on." She looks down at her beautiful wedding clothes. She says, "On my wedding day, still dressed in my wedding clothes, the finest lady in all of Morocco. You expect me to go and shut the door? I'm not going to shut the door." And they stare at each other. A little argument goes back and forth. Eventually, the wife says, "Right, I tell you what, the next person to talk or move must shut the door." And so they sit on this night of all nights, a night meant to be full of laughter and love and passion. And they sit on the sofa staring at each other, full of resentment, full of grumpiness, full of anti towards each other. And after a little while, there's a sound of woofing from outside. Oh, 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 oh. And the dogs have come past, the stray dogs. And the dogs come past, and the dogs are all outside looking in. And eventually they get the dog who's the most sort of charismatic and brave, and they say, "You go and see if it's all right." And the dog comes in, he sees the couple sitting on the sofa, but he seems that they don't look at him. So he says, "All right, in you come, lads." And all the dogs come in and they eat all of the meat and they eat all of the things that the dogs would eat, and they leave. They're very, very happy. And the couple are still sitting there on their sofa staring at each other. And then swinging by in the trees outside come some monkeys, and the monkeys have seen the dogs leave, and they look and they get the monkey the most charismatic looking through the eyes. "In you go and see that." And he sees the couple sitting on the sofa, and he looks at them, but they don't seem to pay him any attention. So he says to the monkeys, "In you come, lads." And the monkeys take all of the fruit and all of the things that the monkeys would want from what's left of what the dogs have left, and the monkeys leave swinging through the trees. But then some robbers come by, and the robbers are tiptoeing along with a mask over their face and a bag with swag written on the back. And the robbers look in, and the robbers tiptoe into the house. They see the couple, they freeze, and then they realize that the couple are not going to look round. So the robbers begin to fill up their bags with all of the jewelry, Persian carpets over their shoulders, and the robbers leave. The couple are still sat there. But then coming past are two police. And the police come by, the police have seen the robbers leave, and the police come in and they look around the room. They see the couple, first thinking they're mannequins on the sofa, and then they realize they're not mannequins. They look round, there's crumbs left by the dogs and the monkeys, and there's empty jewelry packets, and clearly there's been a terrible incident here. And the police start talking to the couple. They say, "Excuse me, do you realize that you've been robbed? It seems like you've had dogs and monkeys and robbers in here. What's going on?" The couple are still completely staring at one another, refusing to talk to the police. And the police start to get a bit cross. They say, "If you don't talk to us, we're going to have to arrest you, I'm afraid." And the couple are still staring at each other. And eventually the police take the man off the sofa and they throw him onto the floor, and they start to hit him with their truncheons. And he still won't talk, and the wife won't talk. And the man is starting to look really bashed up. His face is beginning to become swollen. He's got blood coming out of his nose. The police really giving him a bashing. He's looking up at his wife and she's looking down at him. And eventually one of the police is about to jump onto him. And the wife says, "Stop! He hasn't done anything wrong." And the man looks up from the floor through his swollen, bruised eyes, and he wipes the blood away from his nose and he says, "Ha, now you've got to go and shut the door." And I heard that story for the first time, and I felt personally attacked because I was in a sulk with somebody who I should never have been in a sulk with. So
It's nice. That's really nice. Another story that promotes crime.
yeah, I know. There's there's a recurring theme.
Police brutality resolved the matter.
Well, I grew up listening to rap music, so police brutality is a theme in my listening matter as well.
It was a brilliant story. I just didn't know where it would go. I'd never heard this story and was thinking, where will the story go? I don't know. I have no clue. It was brilliant. All right. Despina, have you got any last questions for Dan, or would you like to wrap up?
I do have a lot, as storytellers often do, but we're running out of time, it seems. So I will just allow our listeners to come up with questions and address them to Dan himself. I think it's best. Dan Sedge, for people looking out there for him.
Yes, sober storyteller on Instagram.
Great name. Thank you very much, Dan.
I hope you get requests to do things about people who need to hear those stories.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's been so nice to see you both. Thank you.
Yes, and
That's
I will
great.
see you at the East Anglian again this year.
I'm going to be there. Yeah.
This year I'm bringing Persa along for the first time, my 11-year-old.
Oh, wow. That's lovely. I look forward to that.
Perfect. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Yes, you too. And have a good Christmas.
You too.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.